Hello again, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. First of all, I want to apologize that my preparation has not been what it usually is for this class. Last 10 days have been pretty tough with reliving my post-traumatic stress. All this rain and flooding has sent me back to the year I spent in the Delta, Vietnam, and it's got me very sleep deprived. Today is lesson number 8 in 1 Corinthians, which will cover chapter 4. Much of what's there is it's straightforward for the most part, and so what I'm going to do is sort of follow the scholarly leads here, and that is they say this is a summation. Paul is kind of doing a random summation as well as trying to give them some warnings. And the summation is of the first section of this four chapters, which then will break and he'll start into so-called individual sins. It is filled with indirect speech in these first 4 chapters, but especially here in his summation, which is a form of rhetorical argument that was quite common to the people of the Greeks in their culture at the time of Paul. At the same time, he's got some blistering irony stuck in there, which is interesting as well. But I don't have time. I didn't have the time to prepare to get into some of those details. So what I want to do is mainly give you the summary that the scholars give of more or less those 4 chapters. Several scholars say it is important to appreciate the mindset of Paul has as he comes to this point in the letter. He is making first and foremost an eschatological argument, in an eschatological framework, I should say, of his argument. That is, that the only judgment that counts is not what's going on in the world today, but what will happen in this next stage in the end time judgment period as the Jewish culture knew it. Paul is absent, we know, but he is aware of the Corinthians' behavior and he's upset. He is none of his people on the ground there at the time, but he has had in the past Silvanus, Timothy, and Apollos, although we don't learn of the other 2. Apollos we have, but not of the other 2 until later in this book, or it may be even in 2 Corinthians. So he sees them as fatherless, without a father figure and lost in their way. So Paul is looking back as their father figure to assess the situation that they're in and issue corrective advice, which would have been a classic approach in the culture of its time for a father figure to do. Some scholars also urge us to remember that it's Paul's gospel that's being preached here. The assumption is that they know Paul's gospel. They didn't have the New Testament. They don't have the Gospels of John, of James, of Peter, and others. The only gospel they've been exposed to, other than what a little bit of might have sneaked in, is the gospel of Paul. So what is, again, that gospel of Paul? We need to understand that Paul is a diaspora Jew with a good tradition in that faith, who has converted to this new understanding, and he's fit what we call Christianity into Judaism. And he uses the family metaphor, classic Jewish family metaphor, for his thinking on this. And he says to them, he's saying to them, and without directly saying so, and we're gathering this from what we get in Galatians and in Romans. You Gentiles can become the adopted children in this God family with all the rights and inheritance that would allow, along with the Jewish children who are there by birthright. But your route into this faith is through the cross as the new covenant that God established with the people of the world. It's offered you, but you do not have the birthright. So consequently, adopted children, the idea of adopted children in that culture being less appreciated, even though they have all these rights. So this is not a stigma. This is not something to be bragging about. Yeah, you're in the family, but you don't have any big reason to be bragging. So you Corinthians have nothing to be high and mighty about, as the cross was scandalous in your culture and your earthly system, and you are now adopted children of God. You're there by faith in the covenant of the cross. God does not, nor do I, Paul implies, want any of my children, whether they be birthright or adopted, to think more or less of one another. So quit this behavior that you have of looking at one another different. And as one scholar says, and I love it, stop it. So he's angry with them. It's a father figure counseling the family. I am very concerned, he says, or implies, your very salvation and the church's survival are at great risk due to your arrogance towards one another, especially the lording over one another based on the various levels of strata in your socio-economic situation, which is the world system. It is not God's system. It is not to be applied here in the church. You are failing to accept that your faith system has different rules for the judgment to come in the end time. There is a new world order, and your socio-economic status means absolutely nothing, nor does your pride as Corinthians thinking that they were the best of the Jews. The best of the Greeks. Therefore, he's after this whole thing of come down and get in the family and be a full member of this family. In this new system, all are equals as brothers and sisters. So when he uses repeatedly this word brothers and sisters, of course in the Greek it's just brothers, but we translate it today brothers and sisters. You are all a family of believers, one family, the same family. And is that same scholar who said stop it, he now says, do you get it? Paul's gospel understanding there is important, but another point that the scholars tell us is that we need to recognize that he uses the ministers, the apostles, whom you now know, and they've been using them as bragging rights. Apparently that's what scholars believe. I was trained or brought into the church by Apollos. I was brought in by Timothy. I was brought in by Paul, and all this making some sort of dichotomy. And he's, of course, against that. And so how does he attack that? He attacks that by saying, look at how we treated one another. That is, how the ministers treat one another. But we are all of one faith, he says. We have different styles. We have different approaches. But we're all after the same mission. And we're all humble based on the worldly standards towards one another. Yes, as a founding apostle, Paul says, I might have a little reason to claim a little superiority, but I don't. I might be able to brag as your founder, but I don't. See how we ministers relate to one another, he's saying, as your example of how you should relate to one another. We are equals, including we ministers are equal with you as members. That is how we keep proper perspective, by considering each of us as servants, helpers, slave. This Greek word that's translated variously there, you may see in different translations. Servant, helper, slave. Most of the time it's servant, I think. But what is he saying there? Hey, there's only one group of people that's lower class than this. And that would be a criminal. So he's saying we are at the bottom of the line. Let's accept that in this new system. We have no reason to be trying to bring in our outside and brag about it. Let's get to this point of being equals, treating one another that way, because after all, we've got the right reward. We are, as ministers, stewards of God's mystery, and we are slaves, servants, helpers to our Lord Jesus Christ. We're all in this together. We're all equals. You folks are hung up, one scholar says, on seeking praise and approval of within your social circle, and you're moving that over into the church, and that is not to be. When the only approval that counts, bottom line, is God's in the end time. And that goes both for the lay and the minister alike. The end game is what counts. And that is won by us staying together, playing by these set of rules that we're in here together, working towards one end, towards one faith. And as one scholar says, he's sort of implying, and if that doesn't happen, both the church's longevity and your salvation are at great risk. So next week we will move into chapter 5, where we will begin to see Paul addressing individual sins that he's aware of, and he goes after those. It gets to be pretty tough. There's some interesting things there. So I hope you're reading ahead. And there's some things that came up in chapter 4 I just didn't have time to develop, and I'll work them in as we go through the book. Have a good Bible study this week.